This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1091, a conversation with Jeff Ryan.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1091. It's a conversation with Jeff Ryan. Jeff Ryan is an author. He's written 4 books, of which we really only talk about 3 of them on this podcast, but he has written 4. He wrote Super Mario, How Nintendo Conquered America, A House Divided, How IWERKS Became Forgotten, and How Walt Disney Became Uncle Walt, Father and Son Issues, The Secret History of Spider-Man, and Your Worshipfulness, starring Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia. We get a lot into the Disney book, as well as we talk about the Spider-Man book in this particular conversation. So Father and Son Issues is specifically zeroes into the Ramitas, John Romita Sr., John Romita Jr., as well as Virginia Romita. And so I really enjoyed that book. I remember kind of seeing it last year, right before I went away on a vacation. It's like, oh, well, that's interesting. No one's really written about the Ramitas. There's such Senior was such a huge, force that kind of helped shape Marvel at a certain period, especially being art director for so long on Marvel. So I was really excited to read a book that kind of focused more on his legacy, because I think he often gets overshadowed. And then also having a book about John Romita Jr., who's obviously hugely influential and still is working today and still doing like covers and interiors. And, so I was very excited to read a book about him. And so I picked that book up kind of as a blind buy, and at the same time also bought the Disney book because I'm like, oh, my wife will probably enjoy this. I don't think she had a chance to read it yet, but I've read it, and I really found it very engrossing and very interesting. So it was really nice to be able to sit down and talk with Jeff about his writing process, how he came to write these books to begin with, and just kind of going through the different steps. So this was really interesting and engaging, at least to me. I hope you find it interesting as well, and pick up his books. They're available on Amazon and other book retailers, and again, I think they're really solid reads, and highly recommend them. You can email me, Adam Chapman, at the Comic Shenanigans podcast at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks so much for listening to the show, for keeping subscribed. If you can drop a review on Apple Podcasts, that'd be really appreciated. Just trying to help the algorithm so more people can enjoy the show. I'm looking at upcoming episodes. Not a lot on the schedule yet. Still finalizing some upcoming interviews. Kelly Thompson should be making a return appearance soon, so I'm very excited about that, as well as some other stuff in the pipeline. Thanks again for listening, and let's jump right into the conversation with Jeff Ryan. Enjoy. Jeff, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
Oh, thanks, Adam. I'm doing great.
Excellent. I'm glad to have you on the show. I really enjoyed one of your most recent books, Father and Son Issues, The Secret History of Spider-Man. I think one of the things I really connected with it was that it feels like we never get to hear Romita's side of the story. This is really a focus on John Romita Sr. and John Romita Jr. So I'm curious, first of all, before we get into the book, I guess I should ask, when did comic books become an interest of yours?
Oh, since I was probably like 11 or 12. That's when my younger brother, we were trying to get him to start reading, so we got him an Iron Man comic book, and I remember it was the final showdown with Mandarin. At the very end, he gets shot by an ex-girlfriend and falls down, and it's not an Iron Man thing that happens, it's a Tony Stark thing that happens, and it was shocking. And then we got pulled in.
That's awesome. I don't think I've ever heard that part of anyone's origin story. Usually we hear about Spider-Man, Superman, not usually Iron Man, so especially that particular period. So that's a really cool thing to hear about.
Yeah. Bob Layden and David Mitchell were the ones that brought me into comics.
I was going to say, was it Kathy Dare that shot him?
I forget who it was, but it was It was purposely designed to be kind of like one of the anonymous ex-girlfriends who you don't remember that much because she didn't have any sort of connection with him, but she was just mad. And the whole next issue is Tony Stark like in a hospital bed about to die. And what I only realized like decades later is that this is reverting back to the status quo. Tony Stark started off as the guy in the cave with a box of scraps who built the Iron Man suit. And then he got healthy, and for 20 years he didn't have that status quo. But then it reset what became a kind of recurring joke in Iron Man's life that he always gets mortally injured in some way, so that he's always stuck in the suit.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting looking at the books that you've written, because obviously it seems to tap into different pieces of childhood and things that you've been interested in. Is that a pretty apt summation of the books you've written so far?
Yes, the 4 books all fit in as they're like the kindergarten backpack quartet. They're all things that people of all ages can appreciate and enjoy.
Now, I mean, I'll eventually get to father and son issues, but I got to ask, like, you start your first book is very exciting. You know, it's an analysis of Super Mario. I'm curious how that was the first book that you worked on.
I am a former video game reviewer. That's what I was doing during the .com era. People were paying me to review video games and write about what I thought about them, which is a fantastic job. I highly recommend getting that job if you can. You also cannot get that job. That is not a job that exists anymore. People do that for free. People, in fact, pay in order to review video games that they also pay to buy. So I was briefly in a very, very comfortable catbird seat. And then that went away, but I had this knowledge of video games and video game history, and I had a unique writing style because I was writing for young people. And I realized that the business audience, the first book we were talking about, Super Mario, was pitched as a business book because it's technically the history of Nintendo, which is a business company. Yeah. And if you've ever read a business book, they're written for dummies. They're written for idiots. They are not written for people who really know their stuff. Like your basic book about comic book history, it's written by someone who really knows what they're talking about. It's going to get called out if they make a mistake. Your business book can be about any old nonsense in the world. You can get away with it, which was a big appeal for me because I could write a whole bunch of nonsense and get away with it. What was it? Sorry, I'm going to go back for a second, but it's interesting looking at the subjects that you've done and the way in which you kind of delve into the histories. Which one was the toughest to kind of find out information on or really dig into? Because you have very different, time periods that you're talking about. You're talking about early days of Mickey Mouse. You're talking about early days of Super Mario. Obviously, relatively formative days for Spider-Man. Which one do you find was the hardest to kind of really lock into getting the material out and figuring out how you were going to kind of parcel it out to the reader? For me, it was the Mickey Mouse book. Growing up, I played Nintendo video games, as you probably did, as all of our readers probably, or all of the listeners probably did. And I watched Star Wars movies, and I read some comic books. But I never really watched Mickey Mouse cartoons growing up because they weren't really around because they're black and white cartoons from the 1930s. We're not living in that sort of childhood. We're generations beyond it. So that was something that I wasn't intimately familiar with, but that was one of the things that made me interested in the project. The two things I knew about Mickey Mouse was that he was the world's most beloved children's entertainer character of all time, and I knew nothing about him. And almost everyone I knew was like, yeah, I think I watched Sorcerer's Apprentice one time, but that's about it. And he's the most beloved character in the world. Like, how is this possible? How can he be the most beloved and no one knows anything at all about him?
Absolutely. Well, so when you're doing the research on that, I mean, obviously, you're finding out information about Walt, and now I'm forgetting the pronunciation. Is it Oob?
Oh, very good question to ask. And either one is correct. So Oob called himself Oob, and Walt called him Ub, which meant everyone else at Disney called him Ub also. But either way, you're right. Okay. So it's interesting hearing it. Like, I obviously... it's interesting, as you say, like that guy, I don't really know much about him. I knew his name. I'd seen it a lot, but I didn't really know anything about him. So I found your book so fascinating to be able to really understand him, and also early Walt, which again is one that I think a lot of people don't really have a good grasp or understanding
probably by design. You kind of talk about this, the idea of the myth that exists of Walt is so interesting. I remember I'm guessing with the research, I mean, you were talking about some of these cartoons, very specific cartoons and gags. Were you getting all the Walt Disney treasure collections and kind of going through all these cartoons? Like, what was that part of the process like?
Part of it, I was watching the cartoons, and making notes, and I cut a lot of that because I described 2 or 3 of the cartoons in detail, but for the rest, I just say, this one's on the ocean, this one's this one's him with a mechanical ball. You don't need my blow by blow. You can watch them yourself. The thing that turned out to be really helpful and that no one else has this is I tracked down a Walt Disney biography that had never been published. So you've heard of authorized biographies?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when you write an authorized biography, but the family of the person you're writing about doesn't like you, is that they decide that the book's not coming out. So Walt Disney had been dead for 6 months when the family hired a guy named Richard Hubler to write a biography. He did so. He interviewed everyone I ever would want to interview for this sort of project, and he took copious notes, and he handed it in, and we don't like you. We don't like this book. So it's not coming out. So there's only one copy in the world. It's the hand-typed copy that he had, and when he died, all of his papers were donated to Boston University, and that's where I found it. And I had to put on these curator gloves, these white gloves, to wear them. So I was cosplaying as Mickey Mouse while I was doing the research.
How did you even find out where it was?
One of the other Walt Disney biographies had a quote, and I didn't recognize the quote. I didn't know where it came from, but I knew that it was a quote from someone who was long dead, so there's no way that this current biographer was able to interview this dead subject. So I looked at the index in the back, and it said, Hubler Box 2 of and it's like, Hubler, what? So then more research, and I realized that there's this whole other biography, but you had to drive to Boston to get it. So I drove to Boston.
Upon looking at it and going through it, could you see why they wouldn't have wanted to publish it, or was it really just we didn't like the guy who wrote it?
Reading between the lines, I figured out the book is very fair-minded. The guy who did it, in order to get people to open up, would be very aggressive. He would say things like, "Oh yeah, Walt Disney, he was a real mean drunk. Give me your best mean Walt Disney drunk story."
Wow.
And now this is the man who just recently died, who was beloved. Think about how people talk about Walt Disney now, and now rewind it 50 years where people actually met him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just to get the good stories. And then he wrote a very even balanced book, but people didn't care about that. They just heard that this guy was around saying all the worst things about Walt to get people to open up.
Hmm. It's interesting because one of the parallels I saw, at least when I was reading through the beginning of the book, and kind of as we see the things that Walt was willing to do because of the era he was kind of coming up in, it did remind me of some of the kind of the things that get talked about with Stan Lee. And it's interesting to see the parallels between them. Yeah,
there's a certain there's a bit that Walt Disney said where it's I'm going to be very magnanimous, and all of you guys could argue about who did what credit for what cartoon, and there's no real way of assigning credit because with Animator did this, but this scene is more important, but it's longer, you did more keyframes here. There's no good way of assigning credit to say who is number one, who's number two. Therefore, my name is going to be the only name on this cartoon. I give this gift to you, the animators. And he's talking tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, he's I'm going to take credit for your work. And I don't know if any of your listeners have heard of Stanley Martin Lieber, but he kind of did that too.
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting to see people reappraise Stan, obviously, over the course of the last 20, 30 years, as more discussion has come out. So I just thought it was interesting to see the parallel because, again, I'm used to the 1950s, 1960s Walt that we always kind of see in old newsreels and, see in Orlando at One Man's Dream and all this. So we don't often see this younger, scrappier version, which is, again, an interesting parallel to the journey of Mickey, that he started out very scrappy and eventually became much more sanitized.
Right. One parallel between Walt and Mickey was not having a full-time job, always just bouncing around from thing to thing. Like, what is Mickey's job? What does he do for a living? No one knows. He just does whatever needs doing at any given time. And that's how Walt worked for a very long time. When he came to Los Angeles, he wanted to be a film director. And apparently you can't just, even back in the 1920s, knock on a door and say, "Hi, I'd like to direct a film for you guys." And then he decided to be an actor. No good. Then he decided to be an extra. No good. Then he decided, I'll go into real estate. And when he decided to go into real estate and quit entertainment, and that is when he got a miracle letter from Universal, which was based in New York for some reason, saying, "We got your Black Cat cartoon, and we just lost the rights to Felix the Cat, and one Black Cat cartoon's as good as another, so we want to hire you."
Crazy. Like, the amount of things that seem to happen, like, just reading at him, like, he lived multiple lifetimes before he was 20.
Yes, yeah, he had 4 bankruptcies before he was like 22 or so.
Which, again, I think I had an idea. Like, obviously I knew that, the as you kind of mentioned, like in the book, the classic story of he lost Oswald and then he was despondent what to do next, right? Like, that's kind of the myth we're all kind of told. You're right. We kind of miss out on the multiple bankruptcies that kind of preceded that, which, again, in some ways feels more indicative of the time that people could just kind of do that.
Yeah, it's the ultimate American success story, which is that if you fail, you then get another chance. The person who has 4 failed restaurants behind him is actually a much better candidate for opening up a new restaurant than someone who has not failed 4 times at a restaurant, because they don't know what mistakes to make. They're just going to make all these mistakes. But the person who's failed 4 times has so much more learning about what not to do that the 5th time is much more likely to be a success.
Having spent so much time kind of in Walt's mind or in Ub's mind, does it change your appreciation of the cartoons that you've now seen? Like, and how much did you have to kind of watch them to start to notice things or start to really pick out what you were talking about in terms of the different things that Ub was kind of pioneering in those shorts?
I started to see how much money each shot cost. I was able to approximate based on how much character recycling and animation and loops were going on, and how many times there were multiple characters on screen and what they were doing, and how many different sorts of colors there were when there were color. So based on that, and on watching other similar cartoons coming out at the same time, I could see how much ahead Disney was, and how they were also in a weird way being economical. Oob was always trying for the economics. He was always trying to find a way of being as inexpensive as possible by putting a lot of money on screen. And speaking of money, if you want to make a Mickey Mouse at home and you have some American change, take a quarter and 2 nickels and line them up. That is Mickey Mouse's head in the correct head circle ratios, and you can make a little circle tracing around them in like 4 seconds, and then you have not only the correct Mickey head, but the person next to you has drawn the exact same thing with the same money. So your Mickey and their Mickey are going to look identical, which is very important in animation because there's no creativity allowed. You got to do it the same time, the same way as everyone else.
Mm-hmm. What was it? I mean, you kind of mentioned kind of what the other cartoons were coming out at the same time. What was it like, and what was like just the process of trying to research and see as many of those as possible?
YouTube is a great help for that. The real challenge is finding out what the names of the cartoons are. Once you find it, you can just type it into YouTube and watch it. But a lot of these older cartoons have been lost, like fully lost. Like there were 3,000 copies that were printed out. They were sent all around the country. People watched them for years. They were off book with them at their local movie theater, and then that knowledge disappeared. And even some stuff in World War II that was made by the U.S. government and were shown all around the world, not just all around the country. We have no evidence of it other than one listing in a logbook saying that this cartoon existed, and it's 9 minutes long.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that was the biggest revelation for me of that Mickey Mouse book that I really, really enjoyed kind of seeing how you saw the thread through was how, it wasn't just enough for Steamboat Willie to be shown. It was the fact that, like, okay, it was showing in one place, but how do you create a fervor over this? Like, how does it really fan this flame? And I don't think I'd really thought about that before, about how it had very limited scale. How do you kind of build out from that, and how would that continue onward? So I really appreciated your book for that way, especially because I never really had thought about, because I think we all just think of Steamboat Willie as a smash and everything was great, but it's very much more complicated and nuanced than that.
Right. For people that don't want to watch like 800 years of 1920 silent films, there was this 2-year period between when Al Jolson said "You ain't seen nothing yet" and the sound film era began, and when good sound films started to hit theaters. For a long time, there were things called overdubs or overcoats, where you would take a silent film and you just add radio-style sound effects. Now, that's not what anyone thinks of nowadays as a sound film. And the idea of, like, well, we've had plays for hundreds of years. Just film a play. Just have your actors on stage talking and then film that. It took 2 years for people to realize, oh, that's what we should do. So it was a really bad hodgepodge of sound putting in with silent films, and it didn't watch very well. So what they decided was that the cartoons beforehand actually had the best use of sound, and Mickey Mouse for a few years was the best, not just sound cartoon, but the best sound film in film history. So he was the vanguard of the sound movement, and then when everyone else caught up, Mickey was already heads and shoulders above everyone else.
I do always find it interesting where when you go back and watch older material, whether it be Disney material, whatever the case might be, seeing things that are pioneered that seem so simple now. Like my favorite is always looking at Citizen Kane and how many quote unquote special effects were actually developed and pioneered for a movie like that we just take for granted now. But at the time would have been considered special effects, and how almost like our understanding of that word has changed over time.
Yeah, like an impressive establishing shot. The Citizen Kane kind of pioneered that. Instead of like, we'll just walk across the street and take a shot of our house, and then we'll go inside and film it. No, we're going to do a dark and stormy night. We'll have a fake backdrop and everything, so that the house looks even more opulent.
Exactly. So actually, one thing I realized, I jumped into so much discussion about Mouse Divided before I kind of went back and, like, how did you writing the Super Mario book even come about? And then we can move forward into, how you got each of the other projects off the ground.
Oh, okay, cool. So the Super Mario book came because I knew about video game history. And I had originally pitched a book on just general video game history, like a timeline of video game history in a coffee table book format. And I was told by the coffee table book industry people, that's not how it works. We will call you if we want a book on, say, Gordie Howe. You don't write a book on Gordie Howe and call us and say, hey, I got a great book for you. So what one of the people very nicely said is, you can take a lot of the material that you've generated for this and you can work up a narrative nonfiction proposal. And narrative nonfiction is what the book world calls a book, like a nonfiction book, something you can sit down and read or listen to. So I realized that I had to change the scope of the project because I couldn't just describe 800,000 pictures that were going to be in this coffee table book. So I needed to pick just one company to write about. And if you're going to write about one company in video games, it's got to be Nintendo. And from there, it's like, I could just write about one character because Mario is, 85% by net weight of Nintendo's output. I won't be able to write about Pokemon. I won't be able to write about Zelda very much, but I can cover most all of the bases of Nintendo this way. So that was my hook. That was just writing about one character in one game company.
What was it like kind of doing the research on a book like this, given how much of it, obviously you frame a lot of the narrative around Nintendo of America, but obviously, the main kind of Nintendo proper is a big player as well. So what was it like kind of doing the research into the different players involved?
It was exciting. I would get so excited thinking, okay, there's something I really want to write about 1982, but I can't write about 1982 because I'm on 1989. I got to make the 1989 chapter as good as I can, and then I get to 90, and then 91, and then I can have my fun thing about 1992. And there was always so much enjoyable stuff for me to find, and people have said that there's a real nostalgia factor that kicks in. They remember these things that they forgot throughout their childhood, but the book brings it up. And I was the very first one to feel that while I was writing the book.
What was, was there a particular favorite anecdote or favorite thing you discovered while researching the book?
The ice capades. So the first time that Mario shows up on screen, other than in a video game that you're playing, was via an ice capade that was aired on some American TV channel, and they had Alyssa Milano and Justin Bateman host, and they had people dressed up as Mario and the princess skating around, and Christopher Hewitt, which Gen X people will remember as Mr. Belvedere, came out playing King Koopa, aka Bowser. So the very first person to play Bowser was not Dennis Hopper, was not Jack Black, was Mr. Belvedere.
Wow. No, had you known that before you did research?
I did not. No. But I found little funny things like that, little pop culture tidbits that I tried to work in as much as possible. So even if you felt like you were off book on the history of Nintendo, it was like, I didn't know that. That's just too bizarre for any human being to know about.
Was the response to the book greater than you expected?
I wasn't sure what to expect. I am the sort of writer who has a lot of trunk novels, and after each trunk novel, which isn't that great, I would send it out to all these agents thinking, this is the one that everyone's going to love, and I wouldn't hear back from anyone. And when I came up with the idea of writing about Super Mario and sent it out, I actually heard back from a lot of agents, and some of them even said yes instead of saying no. So that made me think, oh, this one may be a little bit different. And from there, I wasn't sure what the response was going to be. And it was an incredible response in retrospect. But I wasn't sure if that's just what happened to everyone who has a book come out. Because there's this mix of, it's amazing, I've done the thing that I always wanted to do, and your life is exactly the same as before. No one is really treating you any different, unless you walk up to a total stranger in the street and say, hey, I wrote a book.
So, I mean, it was a few years, obviously, between, the release of Super Mario and A Mouse Divided. So what was the process, as you mentioned, Mickey Mouse, you knew the character, but didn't really know much about the character. So I'm curious, what led that to be your next subject?
The way that Nintendo made Mario super popular was by copying the Mickey Mouse playbook. And the Mickey Mouse playbook is to merchandise the ever-loving blazes out of your main character, but just that one main character. You pick one person, one face, and you identify that face with your company, and that with the style of entertainment you're doing, and that with children's entertainment and fun and goodness and youth and innocence. And so it seemed apparent to me that this is what they did. They were trying to make a new Mickey Mouse. But I didn't know how Disney made Mickey Mouse in the first place. So that took 7 years of research to figure out. Honestly, I just wanted to read a book about how Disney made Mickey Mouse, but no one had written it. So I ended up writing it. They say that's what you're supposed to do, to write the book you want to read.
What was it? I mean, well, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words, but I guess having done the research on Disney, how did you come across, or how did you feel after you'd written the book about Walt Disney the man? And how did you feel going into the project, and how did you feel coming out of it?
I was never a Disney guy growing up. I did like goofy cartoons. When they were on the Disney Channel, I preferred them to the Donald Duck ones because Donald was always angry, and I wasn't an angry kid. I was, Goofy is a goofball, so I saw myself more in him than in Donald. But I didn't have any preconceptions of Walt that needed to be shattered, and I also didn't have any hatred of the guy that I needed to erase to see him as a real person. So on that level, I think I was a good candidate for writing about him, because I didn't love or hate him. He was just a very interesting person. But I also knew I didn't want the spotlight to be entirely on him, because this was a book essentially about a friendship that gets broken up by success. So I wanted to, as much as possible, give equal weight to a guy that hardly anyone has heard of as Walt Disney, arguably the most famous person of the 20th century.
Was the narrative about was that more something you discovered in the research and realizing that it was this thing, or how much did you know about when you started doing the research in earnest?
I knew nothing about Oob. All I knew was that Walt Disney had created Mickey Mouse, and when I started to read up on it and realized, oh no, this other guy did it, and he was Walt Disney's best friend and business partner, and they worked together for 10 years, and they grew up in Kansas City together, and then Walt drummed him out of the company after 1 year of success with Mickey Mouse. That's like, oh, there's like a Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs thing going on here. There may actually be a story here, not just a bunch of Mickey Mouse trivia I put together and call a book. Mm-hmm. So that was exciting for me, but probably a rough period in Oob IWERKS' life.
Mm-hmm. What has the reception to that book been like? Because, again, I mean, I would say it's a very fair-handed portrayal of Walt, but it is at times, hard to reckon with the Walt that some people have in their mind. And again, you didn't necessarily have that in your mind when you went in, because you didn't really have the same reverence for him as a person. But what has the reaction to the book been like over the last 6 years?
I've got very little negative feedback from the book, which is wonderful to hear. There's a lot of people who are almost Disney historians, and the same way that I'm going to just keep on mentioning Canadian stuff here, because I'm happy to talk to a Canadian about this. The same person who could like rattle off a whole bunch of Johnny MacDonald stuff without ever saying, oh, well, Johnny MacDonald also was not a saint. He did these 3 or 4 really awful, horrendous things, but, he was a man in history, and those were the times, but also doesn't let him off the hook. But still be all excited about getting to talk about Johnny MacDonald. Mm-hmm. That's how a lot of the Walt Disney fans are about Walt. That they see him as someone who could be really mean and ornery. They see him as someone who could be really fickle and facile, but they also see him as the spark plug that drove the industry, the only person who could get 1,000 different oars to all row in the same direction.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious, you have a number of quotes in The Mouse Divided from Leonard Maltin, who's obviously a noted film historian, especially when it comes to animation. Did you actually speak with Leonard at any point?
No, I simply read his books on animation. They were very helpful, not just to tell me what Walt was doing, but what everyone else was doing. Mm. And he is a great source if you want to know absolutely everything that is going on in, say, 1927 in the world of animation, because he has lists of every single cartoon and every single director, every single house, and what the innovations were for any of them. And you can look them all up on YouTube. So you quickly become as smart as Leonard Maltin, thanks to Leonard Maltin.
It's interesting because, I'm 41, and I remember when I was 20 or so is when they started making all those Walt Disney Treasures collections, which I love, and I have a number of them. I have, I think, all the Donald Ducks, and I have a bunch of the Mickeys, etc. But I know that those wouldn't exist if he hadn't really pushed for the project. So I'm very thankful, as someone who enjoys, watching 20s and 30s cartoons of Mickey, etc., what he's been able to kind of help, give back to the world, because it wouldn't exist really probably without his kind of pushing Disney to release that material.
Yes, he is the very best sort of historian, the sort of person who is not just learning something and holding it to himself to make himself more of an expert, but is trying to share it with the world and make it as broadly available as possible.
So I'm going to ask you to speculate for a moment. As you said, it's interesting that Mickey is this icon that everyone knows and has a kind of a warm familiarity with to a degree, but a lot of people haven't actually watched a lot of his cartoons because at this point, they're 70, 80 years old. Why do you think Disney hasn't had more of an effort to have those original, cartoons more broadly accessible? Now, obviously, with Disney Plus, there are a smattering of them available, although they're not always the easiest to find on their service, but they do exist. But why do you think they haven't done more to make Mickey the original shorts accessible?
why they haven't made the Mickey shorts more accessible is the same reason why you probably shouldn't take one of those 23andMe tests to find out your genetic heritage. Now, you may find out, oh, well, look at this, I'm a quarter Scottish. I didn't know that. But what's more likely to happen is that a family secret will come out. Not a family secret about you and your parents. That's probably pretty standard, and your brothers and sisters are probably your brothers and sisters, but somewhere around, like some second cousin or some grandparent, you're going to open up a family secret, and people's lives are going to be destroyed and ruined, and you were just stuck for a Christmas present. You decided I'll get my mom a 23andMe, and it'll be fun, and instead it ruins the family. So for the same reason, Disney doesn't want you to watch the old Mickey Mouse cartoons, because there is racism in there is blackface, there is misogyny. The very first Mickey Mouse cartoon, Mickey very clearly sexually assaults Minnie, and she commits suicide in order to stop his assault. She ends up being okay, but that's where we start. That's the baseline of Mickey Mouse. So I can totally see why they didn't want to say, "Hey kids, watch this. This is our corporate mascot."
No, that's fair. Now, let's talk a little bit about Father and Son Issues, which, again, is a book all about, the Romita legacy and what that means for Spider-Man and in comics. Now, this is, again, what really brought me to this book is that we don't often get to hear as much of a focus on John Romita Sr., especially it feels like he's always kind of this really nice guy who's kind of around when everything else is happening, but no one ever focuses the story on him. So I'm curious what led you to decide that he would be, your comic book subject.
I talked to a buddy of mine who was into comics, and I asked, who's the Zelig of comics? Who's the guy who was there for everything, every single moment? Zelig was like a Woody Allen character who was kind of like Forrest Gump in that he happened to be at all the important moments of history. And my buddy thought about it and then said, oh, John Romita. And I looked into it, and sure enough, John Romita worked for Marvel in the 1950s. He spent 8 years drawing romance comics for DC. He did all sorts of other valorous stuff. And then he was there from almost the very beginning of the launch of the Marvel Universe, except he shows up 2 years after Jack Kirby creates all of his great characters. And he's basically cleanup batter, where he comes in after all of the other great creators leave. So he takes over for Steve Ditko in issue 39 of Amazing Spider-Man, and then once Jack Kirby quits the Fantastic Four, guess who gets the call to follow up on the Fantastic Four? Once again, John Romita. So he is in a lot of ways unheralded, because he wasn't the creator of any of the great comic book characters, but he was the sustainer who kept them going. And by the way, when I said he wasn't the creator of any of the great comic book characters, in one day in the 1970s, he creates the Punisher as a villain for Spider-Man. Another day, he creates Wolverine as a nemesis for the Hulk. And another day, he helps create Luke Cage as a new bodybuilder superhero. So he has created a whole lot of incredible characters, but he doesn't get credit for it because he created it in the Marvel way of everyone works together and no one / Stan Lee gets the credit. And he also helped tell all of these stories. And again, Stan Lee got all the credit for all of it. And he was just happy to have a job and to allow himself to be as fully creative as possible. Romance comics, where he worked for 8 years straight, there's no punching, there's no ray guns, there's no fist fights. So you need to just tell the story via pure raw storytelling. So that got into his blood, into his bones. He learned how to tell a story, and a romantic story at that. And once he took over from Spider-Man, Spider-Man became a romance comic book. And that's why when you watch a movie and Peter Parker shows up out of costume, you're not bored. It's not bathroom break time. This is just as important as what he does in the suit.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious, like one of the things I really loved about your book was just the exploration also of, kind of John Romita Sr., the man, and especially like kind of pre-Spider-Man and kind of making his way, because it's always interesting to hear about these kind of Depression era artists and how they approach the work as being like just as a hustle, right? Like it was less about maybe the pure art form and more about the hustle, put food on the table, that kind of thing. And that definitely comes across. I'm curious, what was it like kind of doing the research into Romita's early life?
I love comics and I love comic history, and I purposely not let myself read too many books on comic history because I knew I wanted to write something about superheroes and the comic industry. I thought I'd be writing about Superman, but then in 1 year, 3 different histories of Superman came out. So I was like, well, okay, so much for that. And it took me a while, but I eventually figured out, I can write about Spider-Man, connection with the Romita family and Marvel, and Spider-Man is my favorite superhero, so I have skin in the game there, too. It's not like I'm writing about The Flash. It's like, no problems with The Flash, but I didn't really read The Flash growing up. I read Spider-Man.
Absolutely. Now, it's an interesting book because obviously a lot of the focus ends up being on Senior, but obviously Junior's in there as well. What was it like from a writing standpoint to kind of figure out how much to balance and how much focus to have on Senior versus Junior?
The balance really found itself. I was kind of amazed that I never needed to cut one anecdote or elevate another anecdote to bake up some weight so that it was more of a junior thing than a senior thing at any given chapter. But it did feel very organic. Like this is the story of someone's life, and part of their life is that they cease to become the main character in their own lives. Their kids kind of become the main character in their lives, and they're there to support their kids, and their legacy is what they did and what their children are doing. And that's something as a parent, I'm more accepting with after having written this book, that my job is not to always be the main character in my life. Sometimes I'm a supporting character in other people's lives. So that's kind of how it goes.
What I've always been interested in when it comes to the comic industry is how, it's relatively small and that it's much more intimate. And what I mean by that especially is that I don't have a very big podcast. I like my podcast and I do it so I can talk to comic creators, but I'm able to do that somehow. Whereas I couldn't talk to someone who's in a movie. I couldn't talk to someone who's on a TV show. I couldn't do a lot of those types of things, but there's something about the comic book ecosystem is so different, and the access to creators, etc., is so different and more intimate. And it has kind of always been that way, even going back to early days of comic conventions. So I'm curious what it was like for you to be, you're talking to John Romita Jr. about, his work, etc. You weren't able to, I don't know actually, I don't think you were able to speak to Shigeru Miyamoto. I don't know if you were able to talk to higher ups at Disney, but you're able to have access to your subjects in a way that in the comic book industry that you couldn't maybe do elsewhere. How did you approach that, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, you're right that access is much easier in the comic world. And that was another one of the appeals of writing something about the comic book world, both then and now, is that everyone who is alive, more or less, will take your phone call and will tell you other people who you should contact. So I didn't have too many problems tracking down people it took me a while to get the ball rolling, but once you do, people can say, oh, you want to talk with her, she knows what she's talking about, and then it's like, oh, you got to talk to him because she said you got to talk to him. And I also started to go to conventions. You could just walk up to a guy named Jim Shooter or Dan Slott, and they're just there, and so long as you wait in line, you can talk with them, and they're fonts of incredible stories. You could talk for hours, and I held myself down to just 10 or 15 minutes because I knew there was someone behind me in line. But if you want to talk to comic book creators, go to a show, go to a convention, and they'll be very happy to talk about their art and craft with you.
Absolutely. Now, I have to ask, this is more of a question for me. I'm curious. So I'm a big fan of Tom Brevoort's newsletter he sends out every week. You are the Jeff Ryan who often comments, correct?
I am. Yes, that's me. Yes.
Okay. I'm, again, big fan of it, and I like a lot of your questions, very interesting and thoughtful, because they're often more about comic book history and more about things that aren't as present in maybe current discourse, and so I'm always really interested to see what kind of questions you throw at them. Oh,
thanks. I didn't realize someone appreciated my questions. I'm just trying to Tom Brevoort is the executive editor of Marvel, and he has a weekly Substack newsletter, and he fields questions from people about anything and everything. You can ask him like the most nitty-gritty, mundane detail, and he'll answer. You can also ask, why do you hate Spider-Man? And he will say, I don't hate Spider-Man. My job is to put characters through interesting problems to, to tell good stories. And then very next week, someone's like, yeah, but why do you hate Spider-Man? Why can't you just let him be happy?
That's probably why I liked your questions so much, because it's why they're more noticeable, because they're less unhinged.
Yeah, I like to be hinged.
Yes. I think because one of your most recent questions was about, which I thought was really interesting, was about if they ever had to add in extra pages, an extra 8 pages if there was too many ads to run. I thought it was an interesting question to ask. So yeah, anyways, I enjoy your question. Someone else there is actually paying attention to what you're writing.
Yeah, I worked in magazines for a number of years, and I know that comic books on a basic level are no different than any other magazine. And we would have problems where we would need to add an 8-page mini signature whenever we had too many ads, which was great because, more ads means more money for the company. And we'd have to reduce them when the ads got really, really light.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. I was just trying to think about a question to dovetail off of that. I do have to let you go in a moment. But I'm curious, you did this, again, fantastic book about the Ramitas. Unfortunately, it did come out the year that John Romita Sr. passed away. Did you ever end up having a chance to sit down with John Romita Sr. while writing the book?
I didn't get to sit down with John Sr., but I did find a wealth of interviews from the 1970s. He spent a lot of the 1970s drawing the Daily Spider-Man newspaper strip. And that was a whole new challenge for him to draw because it's only 3 panels wide, and it was reproduced very small, so you couldn't put much detail into the panels, and he needed to do a new one every single day. So he did that for about 4 years, and he was penciling and inking nonstop. And he would bang out like a week's worth over 2 days, and he had been doing this for so long that he could just talk to people while he was working. So he'd call someone up, like a comic historian, and he'd just spin the greatest stories. He'd reveal everything you ever wanted to know about anyone he would ever work with in comics. And he was at the point where he didn't need to be nice and pleasant. He was nice and pleasant. This was his true personality shining through. It wasn't just an old man with an axe to grind. It was an old man's like, oh, you're a sincerely nice person at heart. That's good to know.
Wow, that's amazing. So I'm going to let you go in just a moment, but any final thoughts? I mean, I kind of gave short thrift because I haven't actually talked about your Carrie Fisher and Princess Leia book. But can you give us any hints about what you're working on next?
What I'm working on next is it's still a book about a fictional character, an iconic representation, but it's not a book about a company. It's a book about America. And the fictional person I'm writing about is Columbia, the female personification of America, like the Statue of Liberty lady at the beginning of Columbia Pictures.
Oh, wow. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so each chapter is named after or talks about the history of a different person, place, or thing named Columbia. And some of them leak up into our neighbor to the north, like British Columbia.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
All right. Well, that sounds really exciting. Well, I'll definitely have to keep my eyes out for that. And again, I'll probably keep my eyes out for your name every week on Tom Brevoort's Substack when you're asking great questions. So thank you so much for taking the time. And again, really enjoyed your books. They're really thoroughly researched and very entertainingly written. So thank you so much for all your amazing work.
Oh, thank you, Adam. Great to hear.